Outrage is growing after an audio recording that appears to show the cries of Spanish-speaking children who've been separated from their parents. It was given to an attorney by a whistleblower, and a warning to our viewers, this may be upsetting to some.
It's tough to hear. Being a parent and, you know, just thinking that that was my son is tough to hear. You know, it's tough to hear. But, I mean, I guess we'll just jump right into the discussion. There needs to be laws in place to battle this immigration problem. But this isn't right, what's going on. This has nothing to do with immigration. This is humanity. This is humanity of what's going on
This is what... First of all, American Psychological Association came out and they released their findings on over decades and decades. What happens to a child that's separated from their parents? What happens to a child that's detained and not allowed to be consoled or touched? They said that the child will develop poor impulse control, social withdrawal, problems coping and regulating emotions, low self-esteem, pathological behavior such as tics, tantrums, stealing, and self-punishment. And that's not even including the trauma associated with being ripped away from your parents. So we know the end result of this. We know that the damage, it's torturous for the parents, but we know that the everlasting damage to the children is something that even if we did something now, it's going to take years for those kids to recover.
And how do you think they're going to feel about the United States when they grow up?
I'm embarrassed. I'm ashamed. Al?
I don't know. You know, on our sheet, I was just, while you were talking, I was looking, it says immigrant kids. Because that's how we label them, as immigrant kids. They're not immigrant kids, they're kids. And we know what we're doing. We, in my eyes, and there are two sides, and we have to play both sides because that's what we do here on the TV show. We have to approach it from both sides, but there is no both sides. If the wails from those kids didn't do anything from you, it's because you don't view them as people anymore, and that's okay too. The reason you don't view them as people is since the beginning, there has been a systematic way to break down the way you look at people. If you saw a kid crying on the playground, wandering around saying, "Where's my mommy?" the first thing, I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican, would be like, "Where's this kid's parents?" But the thing is, we don't see that kid anymore as a child. We see that as a number, as a problem, as something we need to turn away and get rid of. They should know better. They should turn around and go back from where they came from. What does this sound like? This sounds like the end of the United States as we know it. This is not being dramatic. Our president started this 3 years ago when he started accusing our sitting president of being not from this country. That is the seed of racism as planted, and that's why we're here now. This has been a systematic thing, and we watched it happen with the kneelings and conflating that with instead of police violence, we conflated that with the national anthem, and now here we are. And we have to wrap, so we can't talk about this.
No, but I think you're going a little bit too far. There is legal immigration. There's
what does that child have to do? What does that kid have to do with anything?
Then let's talk about the children. Let's not bring in everything else.
I'm talking about the children, Jeff, and everybody should be talking about the children. I'm not saying you're not.
No, I know.
I'm just saying this is something. What else are we going to talk about on here?
There's people on the other side that think differently.
I don't care. They're wrong. How about that? How about that?
They're saying the same thing to you.
I don't care. I don't care. I'm so sick of this both sides. I'm so tired. And send any comments you want. Al Jackson on Twitter, whatever you want to say, just bring it. Come on, because you're wrong. I'm sick and tired of this. I'm sick and tired of pretending like we don't see what's going on. We're in the United States watching kids get hauled out of cages.
I know.
And no one can. They want to talk about policy. It's a 5-year-old that wants his mom. And what's wrong? How did we get to this point where we're arguing so much that we've lost the fundamental thing of who we are as people?
You know, you talked about the playground. That was the first thing I thought of. Like, you know, if you saw a child who couldn't find their parent, you would want to, as a human being, find their parent for them. You would want to advocate for that child. But I have to read this because it is Juneteenth, and we'll talk about that later. But this is an article from CNN by Stephen Lubit, and he talks about, as a memoirist put this, and this is about slavery. Bitter and cruel punishments were as nothing to the sufferings I experienced by being separated from my mother. And this is a person who experienced slavery. that means chattel. So when you're talking about systemic classifications of people and taking the human aspects out of them, that is a direct design to make us lose empathy. And we've done it.
All right. Very emotional topic. We are joined, though, by on the phone by a border reporter. Thank you so much, Tori. His name is Oscar Margain from our sister station in Dallas. Oscar, thank you for joining us. You've been in the processing center in McAllen, Texas. What was your impression of it?
Yes, well, it was my first time, even though I've spent quite a few years here on the border already. And my first impressions were, wow, this is a huge warehouse. And I do see a lot of cells, chain link cells, with people inside of them. And so a lot of these folks that I did get to see were basically covering themselves with these foil-like blankets, thermal blankets. And they were just sitting down, kind of like just waiting to see what was going to happen to them.
Oscar, you've been covering the border for a while now. How do you feel about what is happening right now down there?
Well, it's definitely very concerning for a lot of the folks here on the border because they hadn't seen this happen at this degree. Keep in mind, separation of families was going on before the zero-tolerance policy, but that was happening at a lesser rate. DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, would then prosecute only a certain number of illegal border crossers. And so what's happened now with zero tolerance is they increased that rate of prosecution up to over 60% at this point. And so now you're seeing families who used to not be prosecuted just for crossing the border illegally with their child, but now when before it was mostly people that already had criminal backgrounds, were affiliated with gangs, right, or had already crossed the border before illegally and were caught. People who in the previous administration were deemed as criminals.
Let me ask you this. Are there ways for families that are seeking asylum to enter the country where their children will not be taken from them, like a port of entry?
Yes, exactly. So that's the instruction from the Attorney General and Jeff Sessions and also DHS Secretary Nielsen. They're saying you have to go through a port of entry on the southern border, not between the ports of entry, so that you can have your asylum request processed the legal way. That's the way that we won't separate you from your child because you're not going to be prosecuted. And so there are also a certain portion, like I mentioned, 60% rate of those of the people crossing right now are being prosecuted. The 40 other percent are not necessarily. So catch and release continues. And so if you're seeking asylum the right way, or if DHS doesn't have enough resources to prosecute, to send you to the Department of Justice for prosecution, then you're going to be released into the public as part of catch and release with an ankle monitor. And so those are the ways where you won't have your child stripped away from you if you're an immigrant.
Now, Oscar, do you know if there are any measures that are being taken so that this can be communicated to the folks who need it? Because clearly their communication isn't coming as great as ours is.
Do you mean, are you referring to the undocumented immigrants?
Correct.
Right. Well, it's very confusing at this point because the messages are being mixed up at some level. When immigrants were arriving prior to zero tolerance, they were crossing the border illegally through the river or what have you, and they were turning themselves in. Once they started saying, you need to come through a port of entry and we'll process your asylum claim that way, otherwise you'll be prosecuted, people started doing that. But just 2 weeks ago, Customs and Border Protection started installing agents in the middle of the international bridges, and they were basically filtering people who had documents and didn't have documents. If you don't have documents and you're seeking asylum, then you were told to return to Mexico until they had the time and the resources to process your claim.
Wow.
And so now those people are saying, well, what should I do? Should I, go through the port of entry, or should I cross illegally because I need to get to the U.S.? And they're getting stuck in Mexico where
Wow.
they fear for their lives.
Thank you, Oscar, for clarifying that. Really important. Oscar Margain from San Antonio, Texas. Thank you, Oscar.